Good morning, St. Peter's. Great to be with you this Sunday morning and to be able to preach for you today, even though, of course, it's Thursday evening and I'm recording this at home in my study. Nonetheless, we're looking at John chapter 20, and the story of John 20 verses 19 to 31 is a familiar one to anyone who reads their Bible, I'm sure. But equally, it's not unknown to those who have simply heard the colloquial phrase doubting Thomas and undertaken to explore exactly what they think that means. But there's one detail in the story that seems to get scant attention, far less detail than it deserves probably, especially if one reads this story as more than one person's insistence on only seeing is believing. So consider the following details of the story. First, the disciples had heard Mary's testimony, "I have seen the Lord." But then they don't seem to have responded with their own faith until Jesus appeared to them as well. By the time they tell Thomas, "We have seen the Lord," they have already experienced what Thomas says he requires in order to believe, a face-to-face encounter with the risen Christ. None of them had already figured out from their readings of the scriptures that Jesus would rise again, and none of them was altogether willing to burst forward with new faith simply on the word of someone else who said they had seen the Lord. So first, far from being a unique case in his demand for evidence in order to believe that the one he saw put to death on the cross was alive again, Thomas is in fact no different to any of the others. Second, a question which might be worth asking is this: why was Thomas not with them when Jesus first visited the disciples? This question and its possible answers are half speculation, of course, since the story itself, as it's written down, doesn't actually go down this path of inquiry. Nonetheless, I would still suggest that whilst it doesn't go there, the story does permit and even invite an inquiry of this very sort. And one of the creative things that we can do with our Bible reading is allow ourselves to think beyond the text, starting from the story and sort of filling in some of the gaps that are raised by the questions we ask. So you see, whilst verse 24 is typically translated, "But Thomas was not with them when Jesus came," the use of the imperfect tense for "was not with them" suggests that this was an ongoing action or state of affairs, not a one-off or a one-time event. So whilst we could imagine that Thomas wasn't with them because when Jesus showed up he had just gone off to pick up the evening takeaway for the group, another possibility is that Thomas wasn't there with them because he was no longer gathering with the other disciples. The first of those popping out to pick up the takeaway would be the one-off or the one-time event. The second of those, no longer meeting with the group, would be the ongoing state of affairs. So rather than thinking of Thomas as having popped out or just not been there at the right moment to catch the evening appearance of Christ, it's quite possible that he was missing from the action in verses 19 to 23 because he had found the crucifixion so devastating that he had opted to leave the group altogether. Of course, it's only speculation, as I said, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to suggest that Thomas's faith could have been so completely shattered by the events of Good Friday that one explanation for why he wasn't with them when Jesus first appeared was that he was no longer living as a disciple, no longer hanging around with all the others because of what he had seen happen to Jesus on the cross. Third, then, the same kind of a verb tense also appears in verse 25 too. The other disciples told Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." Now again, instead of saying the other disciples told Thomas as a one-off thing that they did, the verse could also be translated, "The other disciples were telling Thomas." so that the emphasis is on something continuous, something like an ongoing dialogue or conversation. It's unlikely, I think, that they only told him the once, and when he rejected what they had to say, they never mentioned it again. Apart from anything else, that wouldn't say much for the quality of the relationships that had formed between them over 3 years of hanging around with Jesus. So I wonder if it isn't more likely that the week between Jesus' first visit to his disciples in verse 19 and his second in verse 26 may well have been a week of intense negotiations, of ongoing conversations to work out how to keep hold of Thomas. If not to reconcile Thomas to the community completely, then at least to work out what sort of community they needed to be in order to keep him included and engaged, even if he didn't believe their testimony about Jesus. And if this is the case, well, it seems like it worked. By the time of Jesus' second visit, in contrast to the first, we are told that Thomas was with the disciples again. And so I guess my point in all this is that I want to suggest that the community of disciples might be far more important to this story than initially meets the eye. That Thomas was present during the second visit with Jesus when he was absent during the first may well be due to the community taking on the role of continuing to embrace Thomas, even when they were at variance with one another in their belief, and even when he might have opted out completely of engagement with the group. It is even conceivable that when Thomas is with them again, he is there with all of his doubts still intact. After all, when Jesus addresses him in verse 27, he says, "Do not doubt, but believe." And that would suggest that the disciples' manner of embrace and reconciliation was not simply to have said to Thomas, "If you believe like us, you're welcome to be part of us here." But maybe more something like, "Well, this is what we believe, and you are still welcome here, however you believe." To that extent, the disciples' task was not to convince Thomas to believe, and certainly not to coerce some indication of resurrection faith out of him before he could authentically give it, as some sort of entry requirement into their group again. Instead, they were able to joyfully embrace their own faith in the risen Jesus, while making community with Thomas both possible and normal, even though he and they believed differently. The point is not to convince Thomas by the power of their arguments, but nonetheless to maintain the integrity of their experience of the risen Jesus and their belief in him, while inviting Thomas to be part of them, whether or not he shared that belief fully at this point. Holding on to their encounter with and belief in the risen Christ didn't exclude a Thomas who thought otherwise. Instead, it enabled them to include and welcome him with the grace and the generosity of the risen one himself. Now, this way of reading the story of Thomas suggests that there is an inclusive DNA to all that the disciples did and all that the church must do: outreach, evangelism, welcome, pastoral care. So if an agnostic person accompanies a partner to worship in church, is the church's immediate role to convert that person to a place of belief? Or is it in the first place to make them feel welcome and loved and included? Or if a faithful member of the congregation revises an aspect of their faith to a point of significant variance within the community or even within the tradition, is the church's role to exclude them from the fellowship on the basis of difference? Or is it to allow them room to believe differently but still as part of it? In other words, belonging to church is not necessarily only on the basis of believing, but believing will almost certainly come to be shaped in time by belonging. And when the church can operate with a disposition such as this, such as that which the disciples showed to Thomas in his crisis of faith, well, there's no doubt about it. We will create communal opportunities for others to meet Christ anew. Amen.